So my name is Julie McGurk. I'm an Associate Director at the Center for Teaching and Learning here at Penn. And I taught my neurodevelopmental course over the summer. Preparing for a course online wasn't quite as much work as I thought it would be. I definitely had to think a little bit more deeply about my course and sort of what the goals are of my course and the purpose of my different assignments. But I think ultimately that really helped to improve the quality of my course in person. So I had a lot of fun with it, and I thought it was a really rewarding experience. So one huge difference between teaching in person and online was just sort of the interpersonal interactions, right? So I got to know my students very easily in person, right? We see each other, we get to know each other, but this was something I had to think very purposefully about when teaching my online class. So I think for any instructor approaching this for the first time, really thinking about how can I get those interpersonal interactions and sort of create a space for that. So it had to be a little bit more thought out. One big thing that I did was just ask my students to introduce themselves. So they had to create videos introducing themselves. And so this was a great way for me to get to know who my students were, get to see them, get to find out what their interests were. But then I also used it to help the students get to know each other. I created videos on my own. I sat in my office. I just sort of did screen capture of PowerPoints. I used a tablet to sort of annotate, just so there was a little bit more dynamic things going on, and then just sort of voiceover from that. I didn't show my face very much, just at the very beginning to sort of introduce the lecture. I used the videos in my class to prepare my students to come to the synchronous session. So this was background material to be able to sort of engage with the activities that we were doing together. Synchronous sessions, we really dug into, so how do we know the things that we know, right? So the background videos talked about, in development, how does a distinct process happen, right? Once we came into the synchronous session, then we really dug into, so what were the mechanisms and how do we know these are the mechanisms that are taking place to have this process happen, right? And so it was very much thinking about experimental process, right? How do we look for evidence of molecular processes, and what sorts of conclusions can we draw from that? In terms of, again, comparing online class and in-person class, I started by saying that you don't have as much of a personal connection. But actually, in some ways, I got to know my students even better in the online class, just because we weren't meeting synchronously as much, and that meant there was a lot more work that we were doing outside of class time. And so I was actually getting to engage more on a one-on-one level with sort of the intellectual work that they were doing, right? So in my in-class, they may be working in groups, and I don't get to sit in on every single group at every single moment, right? But when I'm asking them to do activities outside of class and engage with the same material, I'm getting to see that. So even if they're having a discussion on a discussion board about it, I'm actually privy to that, right? I can actually see what are they thinking, how are they talking about it, that sort of thing. The online experience definitely influenced my in-person class. So one concrete example of this is just sort of how I used primary literature in my class. So I had for the last part of my class, so for the last half of my class in person, we do a lot of primary literature, discussing it in class. But I hadn't really thought that much about what is the purpose of discussing this, right? So we engaged with these texts, we talked about them, but I didn't really have that end goal in mind, right? And so when I had to move a lot of that sort of out of class time, right? So in the individual work that the students were doing, I really had to think about what do I want them to be doing when they're engaging with these journal articles. So not just, what did they find and what was the evidence, but bigger picture sorts of things about how do we critically evaluate these, how do we think about sort of the background, how do we investigate the background of these, because ultimately we were leading up to a paper in which they were asked to review a primary source, and I hadn't really built in the skills of researching background papers and thinking a little bit more deeply about how do we write about sort of limitations and things like that.